sometimes you say, this is a very hard act to follow, and we're moving from, I suppose, big picture, deep questions to something very empirical, but also hopefully dealing with important questions for our nation that deal with issues of corruption, trust and integrity. There you go. It might not ring again. And what we have, my colleagues on the right are part of an ARC linkage grant that is essentially mapping Australia's integrity systems, and all three of them are experts on corruption. And when we look at corruption, we think, what is it? What does it do to the country? And it's one of these issues that is very, very hard to measure. We don't know how much corruption there really is. When corrupt acts take place, they take place in secret. Neither party wants anybody to know about it. But there are proxies, there are other indicators. A lot of our data relate to perceptions of corruption. But there's no point in knowing about all of these unless we know what we're going to do about it. And our next three speakers are going to take us through some of that journey. So first of all, let me introduce AJ Brown.
I think there's some slides, and there they are. How wonderful. Thank you very much, Adam, and it's a great honour and privilege to be here and to have been part of the discussion or witnessed some of the discussion already, which I think we're going to lead off from quite nicely. Adam is a partner in crime in this particular exercise, so we can't get away scot-free. And there's a few other people here who are also part of this particular exercise. And I think one of the beauties of this particular exercise, which is actually to assess the national integrity system, is that you can't afford to be depressed. So I think I think that one of the key things is that we can and should approach these questions, and many of the questions and the points made in the course of this morning, I think, emphasise this, that it's good to know when you're operating from a position of strength. And we do, as social scientists, live and operate in a country where we need to confront our huge challenges, but we do have opportunities to lead not just national thinking but international thinking on the responses to many of the things that we've been hearing about, and which I think Stan, who I welcome to Griffith as a colleague now, has just been painting as a bit of a global picture. Now, why are we assessing a national integrity system, and what is it, and how do we do it, and where does it all lead? I think Fiona Haynes already said this morning that she was suspicious of the idea of a national integrity system, or sceptical, I think might have been the word. And I think that it's always healthy to be sceptical. But one of the reasons why we're doing this is for all the reasons that I think Stan has outlined. We live in a global context. In addition to my day job at Griffith, I have the privilege, sometimes the burden, of being on the board of Transparency International Australia, not just here in Australia, but globally. So certainly get to see the people in our movement who are fighting corruption, not just here in Australia, but in Rwanda, in Cambodia, in the places where the Trump message has licensed the people who once upon a time didn't even bother paying lip service to democracy at all, to now create regimes that where the vestiges of democracy or accountability are of the thinnest and effectively most non-existent kind that is possibly imaginable. So we're in that context, and we have this challenge now to figure out, well, are we assessing integrity systems in isolation from those issues, those political issues, those democratic issues that Stan was telling us about? And the answer has got to be no. So what is a national integrity system? And from Transparency International's history, starting out in the 1990s when everybody was a bit more optimistic, the idea that a democratic framework, a liberal democratic framework and a solid national integrity system were really interchangeable concepts was very much in vogue. Now we can look at it and say, well, that's really not cutting the mustard. And this concept of a national integrity system that Transparency International has sort of inherited and developed really brings those questions right to the fore. You can just look at this concept and say, well, this is what we're up against in many ways, not what is actually helping us, is this particular institutionalisation, or in some cases pseudo-institutionalisation of particular functions and powers. The other thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is the diagram on the right, which is the result, a graphic that resulted from the New Zealand National Integrity System Assessment. You would see that these graphic conceptualisations all rest on a couple of foundations called public awareness and society's values. And you can see that in the New Zealand National Integrity System Assessment, you'll see the Treaty of Waitangi mentioned there as having found its way in as part of New Zealand's, the institutionalisation of New Zealand's values. And I think that raises good questions for us in terms of what is it about our system that we really need to fundamentally rethink politically in order to define and achieve what we really mean by integrity. So we can come back to questions about the fundamentals and the conceptualisation of a national integrity system expressed in those sorts of terms. But one thing that's clear from, and I'll just talk briefly about the theory of this, one thing that is quite clear from what happens in practice internationally in Transparency International when we're really getting down to the brass tacks of assessing what is going on and what is not working and what are the reform opportunities for any political system when it comes to combating corruption and trying to promote integrity, is that it's often got less to do with democracy per se as accountability. And accountability comes in many forms, and accountability has predated democracy. And when I think about Stan's remarks, are we seeing the death of democracy? Well, maybe we're seeing the death of democracy, but maybe we'll see the birth of new and different forms of accountability. I don't think we're seeing the death of democracy, personally, because I don't think we've ever really gotten close to democracy in the way that we should. So without delving massively into the theory, I think when you think about the concept of what we're trying to achieve in the institutionalisation of any system that is designed to pursue integrity and to fight corruption, or control it or contain it, then we have some really interesting tensions going on in which all our disciplines are very much engaged. Being in the presence of at least one Braithwaite, I can't help but emphasise that when we talk about these institutions and this push me, pull you between corruption, integrity, between trying to promote the values we're trying to achieve and trying to combat the behaviour that we don't want, there is an incredibly healthy tension. The whole concept of institutionalising distrust in order to enculturate trust, to channel a famous Braithwaite volume, is built into our ideas of what accountability is and how we achieve it, and therefore also what integrity is and how we achieve it. But for the purposes of the conceptualisation of any system that is designed to pursue integrity or combat corruption, we're not just talking about accountability, nor are we just talking about corruption. If it was just about corruption and fighting corruption, I'd be as sceptical as anybody else. But it's not. It's about the full spectrum. And to start to get back to practicalities, which is where we're going to end up, we live in systems, especially in Australia, where we've innovated with all of these systems. We live in systems where we have constructed institutions and frameworks specifically to create horizontal and divided and mutual accountability in all sorts of ways that develop traditional separations of powers ideas in order specifically to constrain power, to mould power in ways that are intended to pursue or maximise the chances of integrity, however defined, and to combat corruption, sometimes easier to define. And so we have these institutions. This is not an academic exercise. We have a real system. We may not have all invented it the way we wanted it, but we're working with it to try and figure out where it should go very much in the context that Stan painted. We've talked, I think Les mentioned, and and so have others. What's the problem here that we're fighting? And that's been part of the discussion this morning as well. Are we trying to fight corruption in Australia, in our system, when we're talking about regenerating trust and integrity and institutions? Or do we have a confidence problem, or is it a mix of both? And when you look at Australia's slide on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, what we know for sure is that we've got a confidence problem of our own, and we've got a reputation problem, notwithstanding that we're still one of the less corrupt countries in the world, measured in certain terms. We've got a trust problem, and the trust problem is real. It was interesting to hear the references to local government being most trusted. This is in fact very often true, and in fact in the latest Global Corruption Barometer survey that we've run as part of this project, it was interesting just to confirm that the slump in trust in the federal level continues. The slump in trust in state levels is sort of permanent and terminal, but it's no surprise internationally. And notwithstanding all that media about corruption in local government, people do say, well, at least we know how it works and how to get things done, and hence local government retains this sort of innate advantage. How we maximise that is probably one of the more critical questions for us. I think one of the other things that's significant about that is that trust does go up. If you look internationally at the research, trust does revert, trust does repair, and I think that discussion about trust repair that we had this morning applied to the political system is a great discussion that we need to be having, and that's really the focus of trying to assess a system and decide how can we rebuild trust. It would be good if we make sure that we contain corruption and get rid of it as well, but how we can rebuild trust is very much at the core of the exercise. We also know the relationship between different elements of trust, and there hasn't been much unpacking of that, but if we want to start unpacking it, maybe we can in questions. We could talk about probity, we can talk about performance, we can talk about process, all these things that feed into conceptions of public trust. And we now know from this type of research, this is what makes me a political scientist, not just a public policy person, is that we know that calculations of performance as a basis for trust vary. About 20 to 30% of the variance in that is explained by concerns about probity, about corruption, and that they're very much on the rise. That's on the rise. Finally, and I really wanted to share this with you really quickly because this is, I think, really important research. One of the things we've done for the first time is say to the population, okay, you've said you're concerned about corruption, what is it? And this is the first time it's been done internationally. To actually say, what do you mean? What is corruption to you? And before any other prompts. And what's really heartening, and this is one of the things that makes me not depressed and optimistic all the time about working from an Australian base with compulsory voting and all the other things that make us stronger, is the common sense of people. Because when we asked that question of a population sample, it was amazing what a low proportion of people actually said they don't know, they had something in their head. What a low proportion of people talked about the banks. They didn't talk about the banks. Well, 2.5% of people talked about the banks. They talked about government, which is what the question was about. They didn't talk about just disaffection with government, or only 3.7% of people did. They talked about the things that matter, and you can see the things that matter that over 80% of people chose as being the things that they're talking about. And you can see for yourself the common sense of the Australian people, of our political community. It may not be the same everywhere, but that's our political community that we're serving. So to get back to, and I'll start segueing rapidly towards John here, to get back to the heart, sort of the core of this assessment. This assessment isn't just about corruption, it's about all of, or at least all the well-institutionalised national, societal-wide processes that are already built in one way or another fundamentally into, and which we believe should be built into integrity, accountability, all these processes which all hopefully go towards integrity. So we've got a map of those, and there's a survey that's online that you can all participate in if you go to the Griffith website or the Transparency International Australia website, and I encourage you to do so. But one, I guess, it's all nicely encapsulated by this really live debate at the moment about some sort of federal anti-corruption body or national integrity commission, etc. It really sums up the fork in the road that we can take when we want to think about how we apply our knowledge to political development, institutional design, because we always have options. And so I think everybody's been given access, or we can give you access to an options paper we've produced that just focuses on this particular issue. And it's very, having just come from Parliament House, it's very live, as people are probably aware, in these weeks of Parliament. And I guess what I wanted to encapsulate was that was just the nature of the choice, the very practical choice that we have to face when it comes to what we're going to do about our institutions right now and the importance of the different ways that we approach it. And it's really sort of summarised by our options. We can either take an existing messy system and just try and make it work better, which is sort of option one, and not deal with the big gaps and the strategic issues. We can take a siloed approach, and I think for all of us, this is really the critical issue. We can just focus on corruption, establish an anti-corruption body. We can make it really siloed. We can have one institution and somehow pray that it's going to do everything and solve all our problems. It's not going to happen. And we could rely on just, or overwhelmingly, on one discipline and one line of knowledge, which is law. Or we can do what we've mapped out in the options paper, which is to try and take a more system-wide approach. So I won't spell out the content of that system-wide approach, but I think whatever questions get asked based on this audience are really going to flush out all of the different elements that we have to be thinking about when it comes to these sorts of issues. But this is the practicalities, this is the realities of public policy and evidence-based policy making. And so I very much hope we've got your support for taking a system-wide approach to this, rather than just a siloed, narrow approach. And on that note, I'll hand over to somebody who knows the integrity system inside out from a completely non-academic perspective, a man who needs no introduction really, which is our friend and colleague John McMillan.
Yes, John. And the program has Janet next, but we've decided mutually that John will speak second and Janet third.
Good. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, AJ, and good afternoon, everybody. The theme of what I have to say is that people are more likely to have trust and confidence in the integrity of an activity or organisation if there is a clearly defined procedure for raising integrity issues and having them objectively and independently investigated. Now, let me start with an example. Offshore, often the first concern one has on arriving in another country is that you will get ripped off by the taxi driver. Now, I remember a couple of years back visiting Bangkok, and waiting in the taxi queue there was a government official who, as you hopped into a cab, gave you a little card that had the number plate of the taxi on it and a number that you could ring if at the end of the journey you had any concerns about the taxi trip. Now, immediately your fears about being ripped off eviscerated, and of course you could turn your attention to whether you'd misplaced your passport, credit card, phone charger or whatever. Now, we have built on that lesson extensively in Australia. We have the reassurance that if you are in dispute with a government agency, a telco, a banker, an insurance company, a utility company, you can complain to an ombudsman and have an independent analysis of the complaint. We have the reassurance in a world where personal data has become a sought-after commercial commodity that we have privacy principles and privacy commissioners to whom we can go with concerns. And in so many other areas, we have standalone institutions and laws that allow us to address concerns about government secrecy through FAAL acts, about government maladministration through public interest disclosure acts, about fair trading by Australian competition consumer commissions, human rights through human rights commissions and the like. And indeed, when it transpires that there is a distinct lack of community confidence in a government or business activity, often the first response to government is to say, well, we will strengthen the capacity of an institution to deal with it, and hence the recent announcement the government would commit $500 million to ASSA and APRA to allow them better to investigate. And similarly, the deep concerns about sports integrity are met with the current proposal to establish a National Sports Integrity Commission. Now, in so many other ways, government agents or the political and executive arms of government have tried to reassure us that integrity is an important principle by writing it in different standards. The Australian Public Service Values declare that the APS acts with integrity in all that it does. The APS Code of Conduct declares that APS employees must behave honestly and with integrity. The corporate plans of many government departments include a commitment to integrity. For example, Prime Minister and Cabinet, we place the greatest importance on integrity. The opening sentence of the Statement of Ministerial Standards declares that ministers must act in a manner that is consistent with the higher standards of integrity. The Lobbying Code of Conduct declares that its object is to promote trust in the integrity of government processes. ASIC's extensive framework for business regulation in Australia is called the ASIC Market Integrity Rules. So integrity is a strong, reassuring commitment, but what we lack are two things. We lack an overarching integrity statute in Australia, and we lack a National Integrity Commission. Now, the explanation as to why we have national commissions and standalone laws in every other area, but not in relation to corruption and integrity, the explanation commonly given is that we have what is called the multi-agency framework. We have all of the other institutions and laws that were featured that were featured in AJ's PowerPoint. But let me. My view is that there are distinct and serious gaps and weaknesses in investigation of corruption and promotion of integrity at the national level. And let me just give two examples from my own experience. Firstly, my experience as Commonwealth Ombudsman is that people would often come to the Ombudsman with a corruption allegation, for example, about contracting arrangements, personnel recruitment, financial management or whatever. And they would always say, look, I've come to the Ombudsman because I don't know where else to go. And when we would tell them that, look, you know, we're not the dedicated body for corruption, we may need, for example, to contact the AFP. They'd sometimes say, oh no, I'm not interested, I don't want the police involved at this stage. Or if we said, look, we don't have the forensic capacity to undertake corruption investigations, and we may need to speak to the agency, they'd say, oh no, I don't want to do that either. So the complaint would sort of often dwindle away. Now, in a recent experience as acting New South Wales Ombudsman, I found exactly the opposite. In New South Wales, where of course there is an ICAC, and there is also, importantly, a system of mandatory reporting. The ICAC Act requires that the Ombudsman and the principal officer of all public authorities have to report to ICAC, and I quote, any matter that the person suspects on reasonable grounds concerns or may concern corrupt conduct. Now, this mandatory reporting procedure in state government has a powerful influence. People inside government know that any corruption allegation, whether it's misuse of a credit card or something more serious, will be sent on to ACAC. People outside can be reassured immediately that not only is there a procedure, but it will be for reporting, but there's a procedure for dealing with it. And if it's investigated, that it will be it'll be on the public record in a particular way as well. The second example I have concerns what is undoubtedly the most serious allegation you get in any system, an allegation of lack of integrity, misconduct or corruption by an agency head. Now, this is, of course, not just a theoretical issue. There are quite a number of examples just in the last year or so when senior officials have resigned when there have been integrity concerns. And there have been mayors, there have been heads of state government agencies, senior police officers, heads of broadcasting corporations, senior politicians from both sides. So allegations against senior officers are ones that require a very clear procedure for making the allegation, investigating it and reporting it. Now again, at the Commonwealth, what is the procedure? Well, for example, if it's an allegation against an agency head, the allegation goes to the Public Service Commissioner, who is a colleague of and sits on the Secretary's board with the agency head. There is nothing further said in our statute book about what happens with the allegation, how it will be investigated, whether it will be reported, whether the minister will be, or it has to be reported to the minister, but there's nothing about the criteria the minister will look at or how the minister will deal with it. And of course, if the allegation, if it's the quis custodiet issue and the allegation is against the Public Service Commissioner itself, the allegation goes to a subordinate officer, the Merit Protection Commissioner, to look at. Now, I was recently brought in on an independent basis to investigate an integrity complaint against an agency head, and it confirmed my belief that there are serious weaknesses in the current Commonwealth framework. The allegations or complaints had wafted around for about 5 months before they came to me. By that time, the agency head had announced an early retirement, so there was pressure to do it quickly. Of course, there were complaints afterwards that it was done too quickly and too hastily. Because I had held other statutory roles, complaints were then made that comments made in my other statutory roles about the public service caused a conflict of interest and that undermined the fairness of the process. Now, and it was never clear when the report that I did was never clear on the public record for a long while when the report I did was presented to the presiding officers. It's very difficult to find on the public record as well. That would not happen at the state level. At the state level, there is a very clear procedure by which allegations can be raised, reported, investigated, and the results will go on the public record. So, while undoubtedly the Commonwealth does have a strong commitment to integrity, it has distinct weaknesses in the current integrity framework, and these are best addressed through the one or more of the proposals that are arising out of the National Integrity System study that AJ and others are undertaking. Thanks.
Thanks, John, and Janet Ransley.
Thanks, Adam. So AJ has talked about the idea and components of a national integrity system and how that's been used in our study. And John has addressed some of the gaps that he sees as operating at the Commonwealth level. My focus is going to be on prevention and the role of prevention in integrity agencies and integrity systems. The idea that we shouldn't just react to, investigate and sanction after the event of corruption, obviously we need to do that, but that we can actually take an active role to seek to prevent it from occurring in the first place, to reduce it. And despite some suggestions before lunch that all that's needed to achieve that is harsher penalties and some public scalps, I'm going to argue that that's actually not proven by the evidence. The evidence is completely to the contrary. There's clear evidence to show that punitiveness does not deter wrongdoing across a whole range of different areas, and there's no reason to suspect that that doesn't apply in corruption. And instead, I'm going to suggest what might be a more effective way to inculcate prevention into our national integrity system. So one of the key research questions for our study is to what extent prevention is already embedded and happening across the federal and state systems and how it can be further strengthened and promoted. We know, or at least we suspect, that corruption in Australia is low by international standards. As AJ has said, often the comment is, well, what's the problem in a country like Australia? But one of the things that a clearly communicated pro-integrity approach to corruption prevention can do is to rebuild public confidence, or to help rebuild public confidence. And as John has made the point, that knowing that that system exists can be an important role in establishing that confidence. There's other people made that point before lunch as well. So the key challenge here is to have a system that's not dominated by investigations and enforcement, the red end of the double-headed arrow that AJ showed a few minutes ago, but that also gives due weight to prevention and strengthening pro-integrity approaches, the blue end. This can be hard in a public environment that focuses on scandals and punishment and scalps and sees alternatives as some kind of soft or ineffective options. As criminologists, we see this all the time in law and order debates, and there's, again, no reason why corruption would be any different. One of the prime reasons for this is that complex lengthy and costly nature of corruption investigations. They get tied up in adversarial processes, they suck up resources, and this limits the capacity of integrity agencies to undertake more innovative prevention programs. It also affects public confidence as proceedings are long, drawn out. People wonder when it's ever going to come to a head. Despite this, our assessment so far suggests that there is a standard model of corruption prevention across Australia that does rely heavily on legal regulation and tough enforcement, despite the problems that I've mentioned. Extensive resources are directed at catching and prosecuting bad apples, and this is coupled with fairly broad education programs that are said to promote integrity. The underlying assumptions here are that the enforcement activity acts as a deterrent to deter future wrongdoing, and that education alone can promote compliance. Well, another problem is that criminal prosecutions for corruption are generally quite hard to prove. They're hard to investigate, they're hard to collect evidence to a criminal standard, and when they succeed, maximum penalties may not be applied. We often see well-resourced people under investigation mounting endless legal challenges to the corruption investigation, even before they get to a prosecution. And we saw only last week the High Court reversing or throwing out processes that involved an investigation of a very high-profile corruption case in Australia. Again, these types of failed or delayed prosecutions don't send a deterrent message. In fact, they do the complete opposite. They act as a motivator or a provocation for further offending, as people who are inclined to offend can see that there are very few consequences for their actions. And focusing on individual wrongdoers also misses both in organisational context and systems issues. This limits the opportunity to learn from past experiences. We only have to look at the Banking Royal Commission to see how powerful corporate culture can be in an industry context, and we had, again, a lot of discussion about that this morning. As Fiona Haynes said before lunch, it's important not to lose sight of the regimes of permission that have encouraged corruption, conflicts of interest, undue influence, and a general lack of transparency. And any prevention mechanism needs to really focus on those regimes just as much as it does on individual cases of wrongdoing. And most importantly, there is very little empirical evidence to support the idea that strong enforcement, even if it occurs, has any deterrent effect whatsoever to reduce further offending. There is some evidence from the criminological literature that enforcement can deter individuals when there is swift and certain consequences for their actions, when there is clear risk of detection, and where the actions are taken very promptly afterwards. These conditions hardly ever happen with corruption investigations, which go on for years and years. So the evidence is even weaker in organisational contexts where agencies or companies are impliedly supporting corruption. There are also problems with the assumption that education programs alone can improve compliance with rules. We know from the extensive regulatory literature that broad compliance is only likely to be engaged where there is an implied deterrent threat, and I've just mentioned all the problems with deterrence. We need that big gun in reserve in order to be able to promote compliant behaviour. what's needed is a system of graduated responses, the classic responsive regulation pyramid, but the focus on the top end of that pyramid, criminal prosecution, detracts from all the layers that sit below it. So my argument is that the evidence suggests that we need an integrated prevention system as part of a national integrity system, and it needs to be built on at least 6 factors. The first one of those is a broad range of efforts focused on integrity promotion, including integrity plans, education campaigns, training, the development of specific guidelines and standards and advice mechanisms, and this would also be the part where we have a strengthening of regulatory regimes and oversight those regimes of permissiveness. The second part of any strong prevention framework looks at targeted opportunity reduction measures, drawing on situational crime prevention literature, which has shown opportunity reduction as the single most powerful way so far tested to prevent and reduce offending. So we need things like system audits, analysis of intelligence to show trends and system weaknesses, development of early warning systems, target hardening to strengthen weak points, increased monitoring and surveillance, increased guardianship in problem areas, and the neutralisation of motivations that lead to further offending. The third element of a prevention plan would look at improved oversight and detection mechanisms, including targeted audits, strong whistleblowing systems and complaint handling systems, and strengthened investigative capacity. So the types of things that John was just talking about, clearly articulated channels for people who do have something to say about corruption, because there's a hidden activity. Corruption is very dependent on that kind of complaint or whistleblower action rather than detection. We need to, when we do detect this kind of behaviour, have a system of graduated responses, graduated sanctions for less serious detected wrongdoing to try and engage compliance and that self-regulatory motivation that's been shown to be able to be engaged in the regulatory literature. So this includes things like not prosecuting everything, but thinking about the role of warnings, undertakings, improvement plans, just as we do in a whole range of our corporate regulatory areas now. There's no reason why those kinds of approaches can't also apply in corruption prevention. When we do detect more serious wrongdoing, we need swift enforcement action against those involved, which is directed at deterrence. So we need to, because of the requirement for swiftness, we need to look at civil actions, we need to look at fines, we need to look at a range of innovative civil actions, including things like adverse publicity and enforced undertaking. Again, these are not novel. We apply these in a whole range of regulatory schemes looking at corporate behaviour. They can be incorporated very, very easily into a corruption prevention scheme. And finally, we do need criminal prosecutions or licence revocations for agencies and organisations that are involved in corruption at the most egregious offending level to engage that big gun of heightened deterrence. If the whole pyramid rests on the idea of that big gun being in existence, then occasionally it needs to be used, but it needs to be used sparingly, both to save resources and to promote the fairness of the system. So this staged approach moves from prevention based on enhancing compliance at the bottom level, where most of the resources and most of the attention should be focused, through to selected vigorous enforcement at the top end, which I'd argue is the opposite of what happens in most corruption prevention regimes currently around Australia, where resources are focused very heavily on the investigation and prosecution of wrongdoers. That's a campaign that needs to be made to politicians and to the public about perceived soft options, about people being perceived to get away with improper conduct. And I think that's an important part of any remit of any National Integrity Commission, to lead that campaign, to show some courage and honesty in leading that kind of campaign. So my key message is that any integrity system needs to take prevention seriously, and to adopt a systems approach that integrates what we know about what works and what's effective in actually preventing and reducing this problem, rather than focusing all of our resources on catching the bad apples and dealing with them after the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janet. We now have a few minutes for questions, so where do we go? Let's start with Andrew Podger.
A question, a comment was, I want some clarification, probably from you, AJ, about your third option. It's not clear to me, and I've read the document, that whether this is something that subsumes existing integrity or is an umbrella to the existing integrity ones. The danger of it trying to subsume is that the different integrity ones actually have quite different roles to play. Let me give an example. The APS Commission, with supporting the APS values, but the APS values are different from the values of, say, politicians and ministerial advisors. They include being non-partisan and impartial, which you don't expect of politicians. So if you want to have somebody trying to promote the values of the public service, you can't have it done by somebody who actually doesn't understand that that is actually different from the others. So I was wondering whether, in fact, John's comment was more like your option 2, but with a referral and reporting arrangement, rather than the option 3, which looks like it's trying to take over everything else.
Yeah, Matt. There we go. Yeah, no, it's a great question. So the option 3, the only reason why it looks like it's trying to take over everything else is because it's trying to have a few more things on the map. But the Commission itself would neither subsume, other than subsuming Ackley, sorry, Carol, subsuming Ackley, nor try to be an umbrella for everybody, for everybody else. It could set up the mechanisms which would create some more coordination, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an umbrella. And in particular, even because it's on the map, I mean, I'm completely with you in terms of the parliamentary sphere and the political sphere and the administrative sphere there being value in maintaining that separation. I constantly say we shouldn't be opting for a system where we try and treat every parliamentarian like they're a driver's licence inspector or whatever, and nor should we be treating our driver's licence inspectors as if they've got the same responsibilities or duties as politicians. So that's one of the crucial things, I think, where the Commonwealth can lead, by having, at the same time, upgrading and establishing a really good quality parliamentary standards regime, which is actually belongs to the Parliament. And the role of the National Integrity Commission, its first role should not be to be implementing and maintaining that scheme. And I think at an administrative level, I think one of the big problems for the Commonwealth, and you know more about this than anybody, Andrew, except maybe Michael, is the difficulty that the Commonwealth has had in figuring out what a holistic regime looks like for accountability and performance and across the entirety of the Commonwealth's interests, and the fact that the Australian Public Service, that the Act and the values and the code and that whole regime only covers about 2/3 of the Commonwealth. We do have, the PGPA Act, covers every Commonwealth entity, but that's part of what needs to be thought about in terms of what a holistic system would look like. But I think John and I are on the same page here in terms of needing to establish those sorts of mechanisms, but it doesn't mean trying to put all eggs in one basket, and it certainly doesn't need to mean trying to make parliamentary and political standards subject to effectively executive control. So I think that's why a systems approach is exactly what is needed to unpack all of those things. And I think whatever we can do to clarify that we're not talking about either an umbrella, one body that's a total umbrella, nor one body that needs to subsume everybody else, then we're staying on the right track with figuring out what we need to do for what purpose and taking a proper horses for courses approach.
Can I just add briefly that the way the states have dealt with this provides a good guide, I think, because you get differences from one state to another. But take Queensland for example. They've got a fairly broad-scale crime and corruption commission that covers the executive and political arms. But alongside that, you still have very strong, public service commission. You still have an integrity advisor who can provide advice to senior politicians and officials. So, and then within the commission itself, you have distinct arms and processes that will look at corruption issues, and those that will look at educational and promotional issues about integrity. So I think there's a need for a detailed mapping out, but I certainly agree with AJ and with the thrust of your question, Andrew, that you don't want to subsume the existing bodies. I'll just end on the point once again. I think the weakness I find with the Commonwealth system is the assumption that because we have, in one form or another, all of the elements that exist, say, in state level, with the possible exception of mandatory reporting, that all of those elements added together equal what the states have in terms of overarching commissions and statutes, and I don't think that's the case. I think there are just so many gaps and byways where things get lost, or when they are investigated they become embroiled in disputes that really become quite counterproductive.
Thanks. Last question from Fiona.
Yeah, just thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I have 3 short points. One is if you could speak to what I might call beneath the pyramid. You had a picture of, or a survey response in terms of public perceptions of corruption, and it spoke to cosy relationships between business and government. And so it seems to me there are fundamental ribs underpinning a National Integrity Commission or a federal ICAP, whatever you want to call it. And I don't quite see where those bits are in your model, alongside the New Zealand model, where a treaty was part of that, and that comes back to Stan Grant's presentation. So I wondered if you could briefly speak to that. The second is, to what extent does your model support robust politics? And again, I want to go back to Stan's point about a robust political debate, rather than one where integrity is seen as somehow consensus that actually drives politics away. And then the third is, if this gets up, how do you ensure that it's not funded so badly it can never do its job?
And all of that in 2 minutes, AJ.
I'll stand up so I can see Fiona. So I think the first question is that if you look at the paper and see where it leads, then the questions like undue influence regulation, revolving doors, lobbying regulation, political finance, all those sorts of things are all, they require different institutional responses and strengthening in different areas. They won't, and any kind of single National Integrity Commission as such can back that up, but won't be able to do all of that. I mean, converting the Australian Electoral Commission into a proper campaign regulator is what's needed, political finance reform, etc., those other things. So they're on the map, and whether they can be achieved in the next 3 weeks, 6 months, or however long they're going to take is a different question, but they're definitely, it's not a one-size-fits-all from that point of view, as far as I'm concerned, or I think anybody's concerned. The second question was... Yeah, well, I'll come back to that possibly at the end. In terms of resources, question is trying to get the initial appropriation into the legislation is one way to do it. There's not too many other ways to do it, but governments don't like that sort of thing. My eyes are drawn back to Mike Keating again, naturally. But that's one way to do it, and it has been done. I mean, in terms of the underlying values and the Treaty of Waitangi, I think it's really, really interesting and maybe quite a good note to end on. Internationally, when we look at the debate about what is corruption, what will fight corruption, we come back to a really interesting and I think fundamental paradigm of corruption being associated with particularism, with values that are non-universal, people looking after their own group, that identity politics that Stan was talking about, and integrity being associated with universalism, the public interest in the broad, and people serving the public interest in the broad and not acting in their own self-interest or the interests of their immediate associates, family, kin, tribe, people, mob, whatever. And so we've got this inherent sort of, there is like a political, cultural tension built into the fundamentals of that concept of corruption and integrity. And also accountability and our entire political system. So what I find very challenging and interesting, but one that I think has to be addressed as part, for all the reasons that Stan really spelt out, because politics, the politics of universalism has sort of fallen apart. The politics of particularism is what's feeding the anger and the tension and the fake news, and so how we actually get back to that concept of what is the collective communal interest, and in particularly, in a way, in an Australian context where what we're trying to do is reevaluate our own fundamentals of political identity, political history, origins, rights, diversity and inclusion, in a context where our Indigenous population has been growing rapidly, but still struggles to have enough numbers to influence normal one vote, one value electoral politics in the mainstream. So we've got, that's the, it's a really important and interesting. So on one hand, and I'll stop here, on one hand, I started off by saying, personally for me, I'm very optimistic about Australian political culture and the political community. But on the other hand, we've got some real fundamentals that we have to revisit in order to sort of liberate that optimism. But every time I see people get out on the streets, then my optimism has some sort of is rekindled, but in terms of not just reconciliation, but actual recognition of genuine political history and the rights, the political rights that are associated with that. How we then really update our institutions, including the integrity system dimensions of our institutions, is, I think it's a really big challenge for us, culturally and politically, but I do think that the Uluru Statement is a very good place to start. So I would be happy to end on that note, I think.
Great. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panel.